Hello, and welcome to this edition of Sarpy Outlook, a program where we explore democratic ideals from an issues-based perspective. I'm Randy Prier. My guest today is the Reverend Dr. Mel Luetchens from Murdock, Nebraska. Welcome, and before anything else, may I call you Mel?
Please.
Great.
Thank you.
Now, one of the reasons I've asked Mel here today is that in 2012, he was a candidate for the Nebraska Legislature from District 2, which covers a big chunk of southwest Sarpy and all of Cass County here in Nebraska. But you also had another interesting experience in 2012 when you took a trip to what I think is a fascinating archaeological site in Turkey. And so I want to talk about your race for the legislature, but first I want to address the trip to Turkey. Let me ask you first, what is the name of the site and whereabout is it located?
It's Antiochia on the cliff, Antiochia ad Cregum, and it's straight north of Cyprus, on the Turkey coast, 60 miles straight north of Cyprus. It's close to the modern town of Gazi Pasha.
Okay.
And it's ancient town that was started actually in about 170 BCE.
Okay.
And has had for a long time, of course, had continuous civilization.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, before we get into the details about the site, how is it that you came to visit the site?
About 5 years ago, I heard a professor from the University of Nebraska, an art history professor, talk about his dig in Turkey. And I've always been fascinated with ancient history and modern history, too, as far as that goes. And Dr. Michael Hoff was talking about the site that they had discovered, and that he was taking groups over there on a yearly basis every summer during the dig season to continue digging at Antiochia ad Cregum. I was fascinated then, but of course it took that long before the stars were kind of lined up so that I myself could go. So I called him, and even though he usually takes graduate students and some undergraduate students, he said, sure, you can go along. And so I signed up to go last summer.
Well, that's great. You mentioned that it dates back to about 170 AD or BC?
BC, actually.
Okay. And what exactly is at the site? What is the things that they are actually digging into?
The most prominent piece that's the most thoroughly excavated is an imperial temple. A temple to the emperor. I worked on a large mosaic that is going to be even more fantastic because there's much more of it to uncover. And that's one of the things that's gotten the most attention since last summer, because we worked on that and exposed much more of it, and they feel like it's one of the large mosaics. There's a marketplace. This summer they're going to start working on that agora, the marketplace. There's a city gate that we looked at that's partially excavated. There are other baths. We excavated this mosaic in a bath area.
And that is part of what you think is, or they think is a Roman bath, like they normally had in some other cities.
They know it is, and this is a part of the more outside area, the cold bath area, which is kind of an exercise room, a place where people change their clothes and so forth. And then there's a warm bath, and then in the building, a hot bath. So you go through those, and there are also actually, from the Byzantine period, several churches, Christian churches, of course, and there are some monumental burial monuments, some actual graves that they say have. There are some that have bones in them above the Mediterranean Sea.
Do they know some of the history behind the site, how the place came to be, that sort of thing?
It was a site that originally, before at the time when it was formed, it has a wonderful harbor. And became a hangout for pirates.
Oh, okay.
And it was during the time, actually, of Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, that they finally routed out the pirates. And one of the reasons they were interested in starting to excavate there is because they will hope to find something from the pirate era. They haven't found anything from that era, but they haven't excavated the harbor yet, and there's just a wonderful, beautiful harbor.
Well, other than just excavating the site itself, what are some of the other objects of the objectives, rather, of the archaeological dig?
Well, of course, it's always, and this was what was interesting to me. It's one of the things that gives me a lot of interest in the world and in history, and kind of an expanded view of the nature of the world, the nature of civilizations. It helps you understand how people lived and how we've developed. And of course, this is an area where democracy was pretty important, at least during some of those eras with the Roman Empire. And so that's one of the things that's important. It's also the case that it became a bishopric in the church in the Byzantine times. And there's a record that the bishop from Antiochia ad Cregum, there were several Antiochias named after the emperors, of course, but there's an indication that he was one of the bishops who went to the Council of Nicaea, which is one of the famous early Christian church councils in the town of Nicaea. And they have there is that record that the bishop was a representative. Actually went to several councils, so it was a pretty special, important place.
Exactly. Well, I understand that you didn't just visit; you also actually worked on the site. And if I'm correct, they're really attempting to perhaps at least partially reconstruct the temple. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's, as I said, the most thoroughly excavated at this point. They have they think it's pretty much all there, but of course it's dismantled at this point, and laid out. All the stones have been numbered. They have been drawn by an artist. They have been photographed, and they hope to at some point to build that back. That was one of the things they got started on. I asked the professor, Professor Hoff, and there's also a Turkish professor who is working on the mosaics especially. Michael Hoff is the overall director of the dig, but I asked him how long it would take to actually excavate the whole thing.
Oh.
He said, probably 1,000 years.
Oh my goodness. So they're going to be there for a long time.
It's wonderful, and it's just such a rich area of the world, because the Mediterranean world, of course, was the center of things, at least for the Western world. It was the center of things. We sometimes think of ourselves as the center of the world in the West, but obviously we're not. There was an Eastern world that was going on even before this. But
well, and of course, with your background, this would be very close to some of the areas where St. Paul did much of his early ministry work.
Oh, exactly. And it really got developed as more of a center in about 67 of the Common Era. And so it's a little bit after Paul, but I went to Antiochia on the way there, and we went to the town of Sidda, which has been excavated since 1947. It's wonderful along the coast. And it's clear that St. Paul stopped at those places and visited those. So that whole development is just fascinating to me. The pre-Christian era, and then the Christian era, because sometimes we get a little bit centric in our thinking.
Certainly.
And think we're the only ones. But
well, Mel, that is just fascinating, and we could probably spend all day talking about that. I would love to do that, but I do want to turn to your run for the legislature in 2012, and I'm wondering, first, before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, if you maybe see a connection between your interest in this site in Turkey and the run for the legislature. Is there something that kind of ties those things together?
Well, most everything is connected, and
right.
One of the things that I appreciate about it is just learning and understanding, and in some sense dialoguing with people in the past, of course, people in the present, but in some sense personally dialoguing with how people thought, how they lived, to help us understand and help us be open to why we live the way we do today, where we've come from, and in some sense work with, obviously, where we're going in the future. So that kind of an overall view of people in the past, and having to think about where people were, why they were who they were, how the area itself developed. And I think that just applies to today.
And of course, this part of the world is where the very foundations of many of our forms of government started and came from.
Exactly. I worked with a course, informal course at Nebraska Wesleyan I wanted to work it on religion and democracy. Well, we got into that some, but I had a philosophy professor who was been working and writing a book on Greek and Roman democracy, and I'm just fascinated with where we've come on that and with the roots of our democracy.
Certainly. Well, bringing things a little more into the current era, let's talk a little bit about this run for the legislature, because we in Sarpy Outlook are interested in political issues and this part of the country. Well, what kind of involvements have you had in politics before you made the run?
Well, not a lot. I've been related to politics, been very interested in politics for a long time. I've served in state government on some advisory groups and some task forces. When I was in leadership in the church, I felt a little bit cautious about getting directly involved in politics, but I think that was really good preparation in some sense, not only because the church is obviously political. Wherever there are people, why there's politics, but also in terms of trying to be sensitive to people, being open to people, listening to people, dealing with people's concerns. And I think in some ways moving from those kinds of jobs, positions, to working in politics is a way to expand one's sensitivity to people. How do we get cared? How are we cared for? What makes a good, productive society?
But still, there's kind of a little bit of difference between working in boards and committees and groups and like that, and actually deciding to run for elected office. What made you decide to run?
Well, I felt like I could. As I say, in some ways it's an expansion of what I'd been doing. I feel committed to making our system work, to dealing with people's needs. There are a lot of needs that really only government can finally care for. And I feel like it's important to have responsive and responsible people who are working to listen to the public in those situations, and so that was my motivation for getting in. I was encouraged by some people to do that.
Well, let me ask you, was the campaign itself what you expected it to be? What was some of the challenges that you found?
It's a great question. It was more than I expected. One thing, it just really had to work hard to do it, and I learned to respect the process a lot. But it was just full time for anybody who can do it. Can give pretty much full time, and I wasn't able to give totally full time. But it takes all your time. I got into it late, so right before the deadline, and so I had to make up some time in that way from other people. It was wonderful. I suppose everybody says this, and I will too, because it's so true. It's just wonderful to meet the people.
What was your main mode of campaigning?
Actually knocking on doors. And I tried to get out every day. I did a lot of phone calls. Had a few people who were working to help in those endeavors, but for the most part, I did it myself.
It must have been kind of daunting, considering the sheer physical size of the district that
it really
you were
is.
Working for.
The district is difficult. Obviously, Cass County is the big block of it where I live, in the center part of Cass County. but now part of Sarpy County and clear down into Nebraska City.
Sure.
So it's a lot of miles, but it's diverse. It's more diverse. That's one of the things I learned. I didn't realize how many people in this district live by some kind of body of water.
Oh, yeah.
By rivers or lakes. There's some wonderful, wonderful communities. Of course, I'm used to open farm country, so that's a natural for me. I grew up on the farm and back in the old home place. But the diversity of it, it's really an exciting district.
Well, unfortunately, you were unsuccessful in the primary, although you sound like you enjoyed the experience. Would I be fair in saying that?
Oh, I really did. You know, one time, almost, maybe just one day apart, I stopped and talked to a fellow who was working on a small engine out in the yard, and I said, well, I introduced myself this way. He said, I'm not going to vote again. He said, I voted 12 years ago, and something happened at the voting place. He said, I'm not going to vote again. My wife isn't going to vote again either. And then just a little bit later, I knocked on a door, and it actually in the same town, I think, and nobody came to the door. So I left my material on the door. I started walking away, and finally somebody came to the door, an old guy. He came to the door, and he told him what I wanted, and he said, well, you're not going to find many people older than I am down there at the polling place. And I said, well, how old are you? He said, I'm 100 years old.
Oh, wow.
He said, I've voted every time.
Good for him.
So it's just wonderful. You know, you start talking to people and have some amazing experiences.
Have you kept up with what's going on in the legislature since the race?
Somewhat. I've kept up in reading. I've been at the legislature a few times and kept up a little bit.
What's your reaction to some of the goings-on?
Well, it's been a pretty interesting. It's been a pretty interesting legislative session, and some big major issues that are there this year and going to be coming along. In fact, I think tonight is the sine die party at the end of the legislature.
Well, let me ask you the big question then: have you considered running again?
Well, I've had a number of people who really respect and whose opinion I respect who've asked me to do that. So I've had to think about it. I haven't made any decision about it yet. I think that is to come down the line. I think there are some really important issues coming up that I wouldn't mind. I mean, I'd like to have a hand in. But I don't know whether I will do that for sure or not. But one of the issues, of course, is this tax reform that we're getting into, and I think sales tax on all the things that are being proposed, especially like agricultural products and prescription drugs and so forth, is really a bad idea. And so there are issues that pull me.
Well, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, Mel, and we could spend a lot more time talking about this. I do wish you all the best success in your future, and I thank you very much for being with us today on Sarpy Outlook.
Thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure. Appreciate it.